In 1933, in a backstreet shop in Hull, a man named George Hollingbury started charging car batteries for a few pence a week. Nobody called it a retail empire. It was a battery service for people who couldn't afford their own electricity. By the 1990s, that battery shop had become Comet, the name behind that unmistakable black and orange sign on every high street and retail park in Britain. It was where families bought their first color television, their first washing machine, their first Walkman. For nearly 80 years, if you needed something electrical, you went to Comet. Then in the space of 6 weeks at the end of 2012, all 240 stores closed their doors for the last time. 6,500 jobs gone. The sign came down everywhere at once. How does a company that pioneered modern British retail, one that survived depressions, wars, and recessions, fail to survive the one revolution it never saw coming? This is the story of what was lost and why. Hull, in the early 1930s, was a city that ran on the sea. Trawlers came in from the North Atlantic, docks and warehouses lined the Humber, and in nearly every home, a wireless radio sat in the corner of the front room, tuned in each evening for news and entertainment. But radios needed batteries, and batteries ran flat. There was no mains power running through half these terraced houses yet. And even where there was, many families simply couldn't afford to wire a radio into it. George Hollingbury saw the gap. He didn't set out to build a national retail chain. He set out to solve a small practical problem. People needed their radio batteries charged, regularly, cheaply, and without fuss. So in 1933, he opened a modest shop, calling it Comet Battery Stores, and began offering exactly that, a weekly battery charging service, collected and delivered like the milk round. Picture the shop itself, a narrow frontage, the smell of acid and metal, crates of batteries stacked along the walls, the low hum of charging equipment somewhere out the back. Customers were working families, dockers, factory hands, shipyard workers, people for whom a radio was one of the few affordable luxuries in the house, a window onto a wider world from a front room that rarely changed. Hollingbury's instinct was simple but shrewd. Don't wait for customers to come to you with money in hand for expensive goods. Build a relationship around something small, recurring, and essential, and let trust grow from there. That weekly visit, battery in, battery out, was the seed of everything that followed. As radio ownership grew through the 1930s and the technology itself improved, Hollingbury's business naturally evolved. The battery charging service gave way to radio rental, and by the 1950s, Comet had opened its first proper electrical retail store, no longer just servicing radios, but selling them, alongside the earliest television sets beginning to appear in British homes. What made this different from other electrical shops of the era wasn't flash or scale. It was accessibility. Comet was never positioned as a luxury outfitter for the well-to-do. It was built, from its very first customer, around ordinary working people who wanted the modern world brought within reach of their weekly wage. That single idea, technology for everyone, not just the privileged few, would define the company for the next 60 years. It's worth pausing on how modest all of this was. No grand opening, no fanfare, no vision of retail parks or motorway signage. Just one man in Hull, solving one small problem for his neighbors, one battery at a time. But the idea worked. And as Britain itself changed, as more homes gained electricity, as television replaced radio as the center of family life, as wages slowly rose through the post-war decades, the little battery shop in Hull was perfectly positioned to grow with it. By the late 1960s, that growth would take a shape nobody in Hull could have predicted in 1933. Comet was about to reinvent how Britain shopped altogether, moving out of the high street and into a brand new kind of retail space entirely. By the 1970s, something had shifted in Britain's high streets and out-of-town precincts, and Comet was at the center of it. The battery shop from Hull had become a genuine national name, its black and orange signage now a fixture of retail parks from Newcastle to Plymouth. This was Comet's golden era, roughly 1970 through to the turn of the millennium. The decades when going to Comet wasn't just a shopping trip, it was an occasion. Think of what a visit meant for an ordinary family. A new washing machine wasn't bought on a whim. It was planned, saved for, discussed at the kitchen table for weeks beforehand. The trip to Comet was the reward for that planning. A Saturday outing, often the whole family piling into the car, children trailing behind parents down long aisles of gleaming white goods and glowing television screens. The showroom itself had a particular atmosphere. The low murmur of dozens of TVs all playing at once, each tuned to a different channel. The faint smell of new plastic and fresh packaging. Staff in branded shirts weaving between customers, ready to explain the difference between one washing machine spin cycle and another. For many working-class families, Comet represented something larger than convenience. It represented access. Buying on credit or through installment schemes meant a family didn't need the full price of a fridge freezer sitting in a savings account before they could bring one home. That first color television, that first proper hi-fi system, that first automatic washing machine to replace the old mangle, these weren't just appliances. They were milestones. A family's first color TV, delivered and installed by a Comet van, often became a small neighborhood event in itself, with relatives and neighbors popping around that evening to watch something, anything, simply because it was in color. Comet's rise through these decades was inseparable from Britain's own changing relationship with home technology. As cassette players gave way to Walkmans, as VHS recorders arrived in the early 1980s, as home computers and later games consoles began appearing through the 1980s and 90s, Comet stocked them all, positioned as the trusted place where ordinary people went to keep pace with a rapidly modernizing world. The company's own advertising leaned into exactly this reputation: dependable, competitively priced, and unmistakably for everyone, not an elite few. Employees who worked the shop floor during these peak years often describe a genuine sense of pride in the brand. Staff weren't simply selling boxes off a shelf, they were introducing families to technology that would sit at the heart of their homes for the next decade. A good sales assistant might spend 20 minutes with a young couple picking their first fridge freezer, walking them through running costs and reliability, because a wrong recommendation meant a family struggling with a broken appliance and no spare cash to replace it. That relationship of trusted local expertise delivered through a national chain was central to why Comet became a fixture of British life for two whole generations. Consider two customers whose experience, though never individually documented in the historical record, reflects patterns confirmed repeatedly across surveys and retrospectives of British retail from this era. A young couple in Leeds, newly married in the mid-1970s, saving for months to buy their first washing machine on a Comet installment plan. No longer hauling laundry to a launderette every week, a genuine transformation in daily domestic life. Decades later, a father in the early 1990s bringing his son along to choose a first games console, treating the visit itself as a rite of passage, much the way earlier generations had once taken their children to choose a first bicycle. This was also the era in which Comet became something more than a retailer in the towns where it operated. A fixture recognized the way a familiar bank branch or post office might be, part of the accepted landscape of a Saturday high street or retail park. Its distinctive signage, its recognizable television and radio advertising, its presence in nearly every mid-sized British town gave it a kind of civic permanence that few shoppers in the 1980s would have thought to question. And permanence in the 1970s and 80s seemed entirely reasonable. Comet had weathered economic downturns before. It had expanded steadily through recessions that closed other retailers. Its business model, accessible technology, competitive pricing, a trusted high street name, appeared on the surface built to last indefinitely. But underneath that surface, in ways barely visible to the families walking through its showrooms each weekend, the retail landscape that had made Comet's rise possible was quietly beginning to shift. The very technology Comet sold so successfully, increasingly powerful, increasingly personal computing, would within a few short decades give rise to a form of shopping that needed no shop floor, no showroom, no delivery van at all. Nobody browsing the aisles in 1985 could have imagined it, but the seeds of Comet's undoing were already being planted, quietly in laboratories and boardrooms, far removed from the black and orange signs that seemed, at the time, simply permanent. Growth for Comet didn't happen by accident. It happened because George Hollingbury and the team around him made a series of deliberate, and at the time genuinely radical, decisions about how and where British people should shop. The first of these came in 1968, when Comet opened what is widely regarded as one of the first true out-of-town retail stores in Britain on Clough Road in Hull. This wasn't simply a bigger shop, it was a different concept altogether. Rather than squeezing into a cramped high street unit with limited stockroom and passing footfall, Comet placed itself where land was cheaper, car parking was plentiful, and a much larger range of appliances could be displayed under one roof. Customers no longer browsed a narrow window display. They walked into a warehouse-sized showroom and saw the full breadth of what was available, side by side, ready to compare. It was a gamble. British shopping habits in the late 1960s were still overwhelmingly built around the high street and the town center. Asking families to drive out to an industrial estate to buy a television was, for many retailers of the era, an unproven and faintly odd idea. But it worked, and it worked quickly. The Hull store's success convinced Hollingbury's team to open a second in Leeds within a year, and from there the model began to replicate itself across the country through the 1970s. This was also the decade in which Comet's ownership structure transformed. In 1972, the company went public, listing its shares and raising the capital needed to fund faster, more ambitious expansion. Where growth had once depended on reinvested profit from a handful of stores, it could now be funded at a scale that matched the company's ambitions. New stores opened across the Midlands, the North, and eventually the South of England, each following the same basic template Hollingbury had proven in Hull. Out-of-town location, large format showroom, competitive pricing, and a strong emphasis on staff who genuinely understood the products they sold. Growth on this scale inevitably brought new pressures. Maintaining a consistent customer experience across dozens, and eventually well over 100 stores, required standardized training, standardized stock ranges, and a level of central coordination that a single Hull shopkeeper could never have managed alone. Comet built out regional management structures through the 1970s and early 1980s specifically to hold this consistency together as the map of black and orange signage kept expanding. For the thousands of people who came to work for Comet during these years, expansion meant genuine opportunity. A shop floor assistant with the right aptitude could realistically expect to move into store management within a few years, then potentially into regional roles overseeing several branches. For a generation of working people without a university education, Comet offered a real career ladder, something increasingly rare in an economy where traditional heavy industry, particularly around Hull's own docks, was already beginning to contract. Acquisition became the next lever of growth. In 1989, Comet bought out Lasky's, a rival electrical retailer, folding its stores into the Comet estate and eliminating a direct competitor in one move. This was standard practice for ambitious retailers of the era. Rather than compete indefinitely with a rival chain for the same customers, simply absorb it, inherit its store locations, and convert its shop fronts to your own livery. But the most consequential change to Comet's structure had already taken place 5 years earlier, in 1984, when the Hollingbury family sold the business to Woolworths, then under the ownership of Paternoster Stores, the forerunner of what would become the Kingfisher Retail Group. Michael Hollingbury, George's successor at the head of the family business, remained on as chairman for a period following the sale, but the company that had begun as one man's battery charging service in Hull was now, for the first time, a subsidiary within a much larger corporate retail empire. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The sale wasn't a failure, quite the opposite. It was the natural conclusion of 40 years of consistent, well-managed growth, and it gave Comet access to capital and corporate infrastructure that would fund its expansion through the most successful years still to come. Under Kingfisher's ownership, Comet would grow larger than it had ever been under the Hollingbury family alone. But it also meant something else, less visible at the time. The decisions that shaped Comet's future would increasingly be made not by people who remembered charging radio batteries in Hull, but by corporate boards, weighing Comet against other assets in a much larger portfolio. For now, in the 1980s, that arrangement served everyone well. Stores kept opening, profits kept climbing. Few could have guessed how much would eventually hinge on exactly who sat in those boardrooms and what they decided to do with the company Hollingbury had built. By the mid-1980s and through the 1980s, Comet had become something more than a chain of electrical shops. It had become a fixture of national life, one of a small handful of retail names that virtually every household in Britain recognized on sight, whether or not they had ever bought so much as a light bulb from one of its stores. Part of that recognition came from how Comet had originally built its reputation as the retailer that broke the old rules. Before 1964, manufacturers had controlled the price of their own products through resale price maintenance, meaning every electrical shop in the country sold the same television at the same fixed price. Once that system was abolished, Comet was among the first to seize the opportunity, discounting stock by 15 to 45% below manufacturers' recommended prices and advertising those savings openly in newspapers and specialist magazines. One advertisement placed in the Yorkshire Post reportedly drew queues around the block. Even Alan Sugar, the founder of Amstrad and a man who understood retail as well as anyone in Britain, later credited Comet's discount warehouse model with changing the face of the industry, noting plainly that it signaled the end for the small electrical shop on the street corner, unable to compete on price. That reputation for value never really left the brand. Through the 1980s and 90s, Comet's advertising consistently leaned on straightforward, no-nonsense messaging built around savings and reliability rather than glamour. Slogans like Comet Sense positioned the company as the sensible choice for people who wanted good technology without being overcharged for it. It was advertising aimed squarely at kitchen table decisions, not aspirational lifestyles. Comet's cultural footprint extended well beyond its own advertising, too. In November 1990, following the merger of British Satellite Broadcasting and Sky Television into what became Sky B, Comet found itself at the center of a very public dispute, issuing a high court writ seeking £10 million in damages after thousands of satellite dishes it had already sold and stocked were rendered instantly obsolete by the new combined service. It was an uncomfortable reminder that even a retailer as established as Comet was at the mercy of decisions made far outside its own shop fronts. A preview, in miniature, of vulnerabilities that would resurface on a much larger scale 2 decades later. Just months earlier, in May 1990, competition regulators had blocked a proposed merger between Comet and its rival Currys, with independent researchers warning that combining Britain's 2 leading electrical retailers would hand the merged company excessive market power, leaving the public to pay, in effect, for the strategic mistakes both chains had made through the 1980s. The episode said something significant about where Comet now stood. Not a scrappy discount upstart anymore, but one half of a duopoly so dominant that regulators felt compelled to intervene. That dominance came with an odd irony that many customers of the era will remember vividly. Comet and Currys for years used remarkably similar branding. Both companies traded under white lettering set against a red background, similar enough that shoppers regularly bought an item from one chain and mistakenly tried to return it to the other, assuming they were the same business. It was, in its own small way, proof of just how deeply both names had embedded themselves into the everyday texture of British shopping. Recognizable, trusted, and to the average customer, almost interchangeable pillars of the same high street landscape. For families across the country, a trip past those familiar red, or later, black and orange storefronts became part of the rhythm of ordinary life. Not remarkable in itself, simply always there, the way a familiar bus route or corner shop is always there. Children who visited Comet with their parents to choose a new television in the 1980s might easily have brought their own children back through the same doors in the late 1990s, doing precisely the same thing. What made this permanence so powerful was precisely how unremarkable it felt at the time. Nobody walking into a Comet store in 1995 stopped to consider whether the company might not exist within their own lifetime. It occupied the same mental space as the post office or the local bank branch, a piece of civic furniture, assumed rather than questioned. And yet, how many national institutions that feel utterly permanent to one generation turn out, within a few decades, to belong to a world that has already begun quietly disappearing beneath them? By the turn of the millennium, Comet stood at the absolute height of its power. A household name, a market leader, a fixture of the British high street and retail park alike. What almost nobody could see yet was that the very same forces of deregulation and aggressive competition that had once made Comet's own rise possible were about to be turned, with far greater force, against Comet itself. Every collapse has a moment before anyone notices anything is wrong. For Comet, that moment came wrapped in decisions that looked, at the time, like ordinary corporate housekeeping. A merger here, a rebrand there. Nothing that troubled the average customer walking in for a new microwave. But looked at together, in hindsight, they formed the unmistakable outline of a company that had begun losing confidence in what it was. The first sign came in 1996 when Kingfisher, Comet's parent company, acquired the electrical retailer Norweb and merged it into the Comet business. On paper, this was expansion. Another competitor absorbed, another set of stores added to the estate, the same acquisitive logic that had worked so well with the Lasky's purchase back in 1989. But merging two retail cultures into one brand is never simply a matter of swapping signage. Norweb had its own customer base, its own regional identity, its own way of doing things. Folding it into Comet diluted something in the process, even if nobody inside the boardroom would have described it that way at the time. More troubling was what came next. Despite the merger, Comet's performance under Kingfisher's ownership continued to disappoint. By 2003, Kingfisher's leadership had concluded that Comet, along with its French sister chain Darty, no longer belonged within the wider group's portfolio. The two businesses were demerged and spun off into a new standalone company, Keysa Electricals. It was, in essence, an admission that Comet had become a drag on Kingfisher's broader ambitions. Not disastrous, not yet, but no longer a business anyone wanted to actively champion at the top table. Set loose from Kingfisher, Comet under Keysa now had to prove it could stand on its own. And the response over the following years revealed a company that seemed uncertain of its own identity. In September 2005, Comet undertook a rebranding campaign costing £20 million, dropping its long-standing Comet Sense strapline in favor of We Live Electricals, launched alongside a new World of Electricals advertising push. 3 years later, in 2008, the slogan changed again to We Deal in Your Ideal. Two complete repositioning campaigns within 3 years is not, in retail, typically the mark of a confident market leader refining a winning formula. It is far more often the mark of a company anxiously searching for a message that will finally stick, because the previous one hadn't quite worked. There was a stranger problem sitting alongside all this internal repositioning, one entirely outside Comet's control. For years, its own branding had been so visually similar to that of its main rival, Currys, that shoppers routinely tried to return goods to the wrong shop entirely. Two of Britain's largest electrical retailers, trading almost interchangeably in the public mind, both selling the same manufacturer's stock at similar prices in near-identical red and white livery. In a market that close, differentiation isn't a luxury, it's survival. And Comet, through the 2000s, was visibly struggling to carve out a distinct reason for customers to choose it specifically, rather than simply whichever big electrical shop happened to be nearest. Underneath all of this sat the crack that would, in time, prove fatal. A retail model built entirely around large, expensive physical showrooms. The very model that had made Comet's fortune back in 1968 was about to be challenged by a form of shopping that needed no showroom at all. Through the early to mid-2000s, online retail was no longer a novelty confined to books and CDs. Consumer electronics, precisely Comet's core category, were increasingly researched, compared, and purchased online, often at prices a store carrying the overheads of rent, staff, and utilities on dozens of retail parks simply couldn't match. This is where the dramatic irony of Comet's story becomes most visible. A customer walking into a Comet store in, say, 2006 to buy a new television would have experienced nothing unusual at all. The same knowledgeable staff, the same rows of gleaming screens, the same installment finance options that had served families for decades. From the shop floor, everything felt entirely normal, perhaps even thriving, given how busy some stores remained. But that same customer, increasingly, had already done their real research the night before, on a computer at home, comparing Comet's price against 3 or 4 competitors with nothing but a few clicks. The showroom visit was, more and more often, simply the final step in a decision largely made elsewhere, and sometimes the final step before walking straight back out and ordering online for less. Did Comet's leadership see this coming? To some degree, certainly. No retailer with any competence could have been entirely blind to the internet's growing role in consumer electronics through the 2000s. But recognizing a threat and restructuring an entire business model built around physical showrooms are two very different challenges, and one that Kisa's leadership, preoccupied with its own repeated rebranding efforts and mixed financial performance, appears not to have solved with anything like the urgency the moment demanded. How much resilience really does a company have left when it needs a new slogan every 3 years, just to remind customers why they should still walk through the door? None of this was yet visible as Collapse. Comet remained in the mid-2000s, a major national retailer with hundreds of stores and millions of customers. But the foundations that had felt so permanent through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s were now quietly shifting beneath a business that had spent 40 years perfecting exactly the kind of retail experience the internet was about to make optional. By 2011, Comet's problems had stopped being subtle. Years of underwhelming performance under Kisa Electricals had left the company visibly struggling against a retail landscape that was moving faster than its store-based model could follow. And in November of that year, Kisa made a decision that would set in motion the final chapter of Comet's story. It sold the entire business, 240 stores, thousands of staff, 80 years of brand history, to a private equity firm called Opcapita for a single token payment of £2. £2, less than the price of a sandwich. It sounds almost like a misprint, but it wasn't. It was a calculated financial arrangement, and understanding why requires looking past the headline figure to what came attached to it. As part of the deal, Kisa agreed to provide Opcapita with a dowry of $46.8 million in working capital, cash intended to help stabilize Comet's operations under its new owner. Just as significantly, Kisa chose to retain the pension liabilities for employees still on the company's pre-existing defined benefit schemes, meaning Opcapita inherited the stores, the staff, and the brand, but not the long-term financial obligation to former employees' retirement funds. For Opcapita, this was, on paper, an attractive proposition. Acquire a major national retail chain for next to nothing, receive tens of millions in working capital to smooth the transition, and take on none of the pension burden that had built up over decades. Whatever Opcapita's own account of its intentions, the structure of the deal itself tells its own story about where the financial risk was designed to sit and where it wasn't. What happened next moved with startling speed. Opcapita had owned Comet for barely 12 months when, according to reporting at the time, the firm began exploring options to sell the chain on, a full 2 weeks before Comet would ultimately file for administration. 12 months is not, in retail terms, a meaningful window in which to execute a genuine turnaround of a struggling national chain with hundreds of stores and thousands of staff. It is, however, entirely sufficient time to restructure a balance sheet, extract value, and move toward an exit. On the 1st of November 2012, Comet announced it was filing for administration. The company entered administration formally the following day, with the accountancy firm Deloitte appointed to oversee the process. A company spokesman, in a statement that now reads with a certain bleak irony, said the board was urgently working with its advisors to seek a solution to secure a viable future for the company. Behind that statement lay a more immediate and less survivable pressure. In the run-up to the crucial Christmas trading period, suppliers, the manufacturers whose televisions, washing machines, and games consoles filled Comet's showrooms, had begun insisting on payment in advance for stock, no longer willing to extend the credit terms that any retailer depends on to function. When your own suppliers stop trusting you to pay them later, the end is usually very close. The human cost of what followed would take years to fully surface, and when it did, it revealed just how badly the people who had actually kept Comet's stores running had been let down. In June 2014, 18 months after the last store closed its doors, former staff, represented by the Union of Shop, Distributive and Allied Workers alongside the United Road Transport Union, won an employment tribunal case establishing that they had not been properly consulted about the redundancies that cost them their jobs. The ruling opened the door for roughly 7,000 former Comet employees to apply for government redundancy financial assistance, support that should, under the correct process, never have needed to fall on the taxpayer in the first place. The financial reckoning that followed was, in its own way, more damning than the tribunal ruling itself. Accounting records examined after the collapse suggested that Comet's owners, including Op Capita and the investment firm Elliott Advisors, recovered somewhere in the region of $117 million from the business, even as it collapsed into administration. Administration fees charged by Deloitte, meanwhile, ran to more than $10 million. And three of the Deloitte administrators overseeing the process were subsequently referred to the accountancy profession's own regulator by the Insolvency Service over the failure to properly consult staff about redundancy, the very failure the Employment Tribunal had already ruled on. The government's own costs for covering the resulting redundancy payments came to approximately $26 million. Sit with those numbers for a moment, side by side. Roughly $117 million recovered by the investment firms that had owned Comet for barely a year. Roughly $26 million in redundancy costs ultimately picked up by the state, because the company that had employed these people for years, sometimes decades, folded without giving them the process the law said they were owed. None of this was visible to the shop floor employee arranging a delivery slot for a customer's new fridge in early 2012, or to the family walking in that spring to finally buy the flat-screen television they'd been saving toward. From the customer's side of the till, Comet in early 2012 still looked, largely, like the same trusted chain it had always been. The decisions that would end it were already being made. Not on any shop floor, but in boardrooms and legal offices, weighing balance sheets and exit strategies most employees would never see until the announcement came. Whose responsibility, in the end, was it to protect the people who had spent their working lives keeping those stores running? The firm that sold the business for £2 and washed its hands of the pension liabilities? The investors who bought it and began planning their exit within a year? Or the administrators paid millions to manage the very process later found to have failed the workers at its center? There is no single villain in this story, in the sense of one person acting alone, but there is unmistakably a chain of decisions in which financial extraction was managed with considerably more care than the livelihoods of the 6,500 people who would lose their jobs before the year was out. What remained by the final weeks of 2012 was simply the public unraveling of a business already effectively decided behind closed doors. The empty shelves, the liquidation banners, the doors that would not open again. On the 1st of November 2012, the news broke that so many Comet employees had quietly feared for months but hoped somehow would not arrive. The company was filing for administration. The following day, administration was formally confirmed, with Deloitte appointed to manage what remained of the business. For staff who had spent that Friday morning serving customers as normal, the announcement landed like a door slamming shut on 80 years of history in the space of a single news bulletin. The website went first. Comet's online store, through which customers could once browse and order the same televisions and washing machines available in its physical showrooms, simply stopped working. For 2 days it sat dark, inaccessible to visitors, until 3rd of November, when it reappeared not as a working shop but as a liquidation notice. Details of store locations, and the unmistakable language of a business now being wound down rather than run. Inside the physical stores, the transformation was just as stark. At 9 o'clock on the morning of 8 November, Comet's remaining outlets began their final liquidation stock sale. Shelves that had once been arranged with the careful, deliberate merchandising of a company proud of its showrooms now carried the hurried red and yellow signage of a closing down sale. In a small, almost bureaucratic irony, Comet also resumed accepting its own gift cards that same day. Vouchers that, only weeks earlier, customers might reasonably have worried would become worthless overnight. Briefly honored again, even as the company that issued them was already being dismantled. For the employees still coming into work each day, the atmosphere must have been almost unbearable, carrying out the ordinary rituals of retail, greeting customers, processing sales, while knowing that every transaction now counted down toward an ending rather than building toward a future. Consider what that meant for someone who had spent 15 or 20 years with the company, arranging deliveries, training new starters, building relationships with regular customers who'd bought every appliance in their house from the same familiar face. Now watching that entire working life compressed into a liquidation sale lasting weeks. The uncertainty deepened further on 17th of November, when administrators announced that at least 41 of the company's remaining 236 stores would close permanently unless a buyer could be found to take them over by the end of the month. The announcement had an immediate visible effect. 27 of those stores began closing down sales straight away, while 14 more were told to expect the same fate shortly after. For staff in those 27 branches, reportedly up to 500 people, the countdown was no longer abstract. It had a date attached to it. No buyer capable of rescuing the business as a going concern ever materialized. Over the following weeks, the closures continued in waves rather than all at once. A store here finishing its liquidation sale and shutting its shutters for the final time. Then another. Then another. The black and orange signage coming down permanently across the country in a slow, grinding sequence rather than a single dramatic collapse. By the end of December 2012, there were no Comet stores left open anywhere in Britain. 240 locations gone. 6,500 jobs gone with them. For customers, the experience of watching this unfold was strange in its own way. A kind of slow-motion disappearance of something that had always simply been there. Families who had bought their washing machines, their first flat-screen televisions, their children's first games consoles from a particular local Comet store found themselves in the space of a few weeks walking past a building stripped of stock, its shelves bare, its familiar staff gone, its windows papered over with closing down banners. For anyone who had grown up treating a Comet visit as a genuine family occasion, the Saturday trip to choose a new appliance together, watching that same shop front reduced to an empty liquidation shell carried a particular kind of quiet grief, even for those who had no personal stake in the company beyond decades of ordinary shopping. Media coverage through November and December 2012 treated the story with the gravity it deserved, not merely as a business failure, but as a genuine loss to communities up and down the country. One more household name joining a growing list of British high street casualties in the years following the financial crisis. There was no shortage of press attention on the scale of the job losses or on the questions already beginning to surface about how a company sold for £2 barely a year earlier had ended up here. Questions that would only sharpen once the details of the Op Capita deal and its aftermath became fully public. For the employees who had built careers within Comet's structure, the shop floor staff who had worked their way into store management, the regional managers who had spent decades inside the company, Hollingbury's small hull shop had grown into. The collapse meant more than a single redundancy notice. It meant the sudden end of an entire career track that had offered, for 2 generations of working people without university degrees, a genuine and respected path to advancement. Some would find similar roles at surviving retailers like Currys, absorbing displaced staff and inheriting some of Comet's old store leases. Others, particularly those further along in their careers, faced a much harder search for equivalent work in a retail sector still reeling from the wider effects of the financial crisis and increasingly hostile toward the large-format showroom model Comet had spent 44 years perfecting. The buildings themselves faced a similarly uncertain fate. Many of the out-of-town retail park units Comet had once occupied, precisely the format the company had pioneered back in 1968, sat empty for months or years afterward. Too specialized in size and layout for easy conversion to other uses, becoming a familiar and slightly melancholy feature of British retail parks throughout the mid-2010s. The shuttered unit everyone recognized, even after the sign itself had finally come down. By the time the last store closed its shutters before Christmas 2012, what had vanished was not simply a retailer. It was the last physical remnant of a business relationship that had, for many British families, spanned 3 generations. Grandparents who had first walked into a Comet showroom in the 1970s, parents who had bought their own family's first color television there in the 1980s, and children who had chosen their first games console from the very same shelves in the 1990s and 2000s. All of it, the whole accumulated weight of those decades, ended not with a single dramatic event, but with a liquidation sale that quietly worked its way through the calendar until there was simply nothing left to sell. In the weeks and months after Comet's stores closed for the last time, the gap it left behind was not abstract. It was physical, visible, and immediate. Vacant units on retail parks from Newcastle to Plymouth, sitting dark where black and orange signage had stood for decades. Some of that space was eventually absorbed by Currys, which inherited a number of former Comet leases, and, in the process, a portion of the displaced customer base that had nowhere else local left to go. Increasingly, though, the customers Comet had once served simply moved online altogether, completing the very shift in shopping behavior that had helped bring the company down in the first place. The story did not end entirely with the 2012 closures, however. In August 2020, nearly 8 years after the last store shuttered, the Comet name returned, not as a chain of showrooms, but as an online-only retailer, revived by Misco Technologies, an established UK IT reseller, looking to put its own infrastructure behind a brand that still carried genuine public goodwill. It was a modest rebirth by the standards of the original company, but a rebirth nonetheless, built entirely around the recognition that Comet still meant something to people who remembered it. The brand changed hands again in May 2025, when the online marketplace OnBuy acquired it from Misco, with plans for a further $10 million relaunch as a digital electronics marketplace by the end of that year. Misco's managing director announcing the sale after what he described as 6 years of exponential growth in the company's core business, framed the decision simply as the right moment to let the Comet name move on to its next chapter under new ownership. What does this tell us about the broader industry Comet once helped define? Its collapse was never really an isolated accident of bad luck or one poorly timed recession. It followed a pattern that would repeat with variations across British and American retail alike through the 2010s. A private equity ownership structure that extracted value while retaining minimal long-term risk, layered on top of a business already struggling to adapt a large format, showroom-heavy model to an increasingly online marketplace. Comet's own history makes this almost too neat an illustration. A company that had built its original fortune in 1968 by pioneering a bold new retail format, ultimately undone 44 years later by its inability to pioneer the next one. The economic impact on the communities that had depended on Comet stores extended well beyond the 6,500 people who lost their jobs directly. Local suppliers, delivery contractors, and the smaller businesses that had grown up around busy retail parks anchored by a major chain like Comet all felt the effects of its disappearance. In towns where a Comet store had been one of relatively few large employers offering a genuine career path without a university degree, the loss of that structure was not easily replaced by an online retailer with no local premises and no shop floor staff to promote into management. For the former employees at the center of the story, the aftermath carried a particular sting that went beyond simply losing a job. The 2014 Employment Tribunal ruling, which found that staff had not been properly consulted about their redundancies, meant that thousands of people who had already lost their positions then had to spend a further 2 years navigating a legal process just to secure the financial assistance they should reasonably have received at the outset. Some former staff found their way into retail elsewhere, at Currys or other chains that absorbed part of the market Comet vacated. Others, particularly those who had spent decades building specialized expertise in a single company's systems and culture, found the transition considerably harder, entering a job market still recovering from the wider effects of the financial crisis. There is a specific sobering lesson sitting inside Comet's collapse for anyone paying attention to how modern retail actually works. A business can look entirely stable from the customer side of the till right up until the moment it isn't. Comet's showrooms were still busy, its staff still knowledgeable, its brand still trusted. In the very same year, its ownership structure was already being arranged for maximum extraction rather than long-term survival. The people who bought their televisions and washing machines there in early 2012 had no way of knowing that the decisions determining the company's fate had already been made in rooms they would never see by people whose primary obligation was not to the business's future, but to their own return on investment. What then do we actually lose as a society when a gathering place like this disappears? Not just a shop, but a shared point of reference across 3 generations of the same families? And nothing quite takes its place. Comet is, in this sense, more than a cautionary tale about one retailer's failure to keep pace with the internet. It is a case study in what happens when the financial structures managing a company's decline are permitted to move faster and with far greater care than the protections in place for the people who kept that company running in the first place. Picture once more a Saturday afternoon sometime in the 1980s, a family car pulling into a retail park, the black and orange sign visible from the road long before the entrance itself. Inside the particular hum of a Comet showroom on a busy weekend, dozens of television screens all glowing at once, each tuned to something different, the low murmur of conversation between customers and staff who actually knew the difference between one washing machine and the next, the faint smell of new plastic and fresh cardboard packaging, a father crouching to read the specifications on a fridge freezer, a child half listening, drawn instead toward the wall of televisions, watching cartoons flicker across 20 screens simultaneously. Somewhere else, a different Saturday, a different decade. A teenager choosing a first Walkman with birthday money clutched in one hand, or a young couple standing before a washing machine they'd been saving toward for months, doing the quiet arithmetic of installments in their heads before finally, nervously, saying yes. These were not remarkable moments in any single family's history. They were simply Saturdays, and that was precisely the point. Comet did not need to be remarkable to matter. It only needed to be there, reliably, for as long as anyone could remember. What made a place like Comet matter was never really the appliances themselves. Televisions and washing machines can, in the end, be bought almost anywhere. What Comet offered, for the better part of 80 years, was something harder to replace. A trusted local presence where working families, often without much spare money, could bring modern technology into their homes without being made to feel like the transaction was beyond their means. It offered credit terms that made a first washing machine possible for a young couple starting out. It offered staff who would spend 20 unhurried minutes helping a family choose correctly, because a wrong choice meant real hardship for people with little room to absorb one. It offered, too, something to a different kind of person entirely. The shop floor assistant who could work their way into store management without ever having set foot in a university, at a time when that kind of steady, respectable advancement was becoming harder to find elsewhere. For 2 generations, Comet was not simply a place people shopped. It was a place people built careers, raised families around, and marked time by. The year of the first color television, the year of the first proper hi-fi, the year the children finally got their own games console. None of this made Comet unique in the strictest sense. Britain has had other retailers, other household names, other familiar shop fronts that came to feel like part of the landscape itself. But Comet's particular contribution was in how ordinary it made the extraordinary feel. How a piece of technology that would once have seemed impossibly modern, a color television, a home computer, became simply another Saturday purchase, brought within reach of people who had never expected such things to belong to them. That quietly was Comet's real achievement. Not the 80 years it lasted, but the accessibility it built into every one of them. It would be easy to tell this story purely as a warning, a lesson in what happens when a business fails to adapt, or when financial decisions are made with more care for return than for the people who depend on a company's survival. Both of those things are true and both deserve to be remembered honestly. But that is not the whole of what Comet was, and it should not be the whole of what remains. What deserves equal remembrance is George Hollingbury, a man who began with nothing more than a battery charging service in Hull and built from that small and unremarkable beginning something that would shape how an entire country shopped for the better part of a century. What deserves remembrance, too, are the thousands of staff, shop floor assistants, delivery drivers, store managers, warehouse workers, who spent their working lives helping ordinary families bring a little more of the modern world into their homes, often with more genuine care than the transaction strictly required. And what deserves remembrance, finally, are the customers themselves. The families who chose their first color television together, who saved patiently for a washing machine, who brought their own children back through the same doors a generation later. Comet is gone now. Its stores closed, its showrooms emptied, its 80-year run ended in a matter of weeks. But the memory of what it offered, access, trust, a familiar presence in ordinary lives, remains exactly where it always lived. Not in a boardroom, not in a balance sheet, but in the quiet recollection of everyone who ever walked through those doors and came out carrying something they had genuinely needed, at a price they could genuinely afford. That, in the end, is worth remembering and worth keeping.